The small town of Pine Grove had always been a quiet place, especially in the peaceful neighborhood where Mr. Chen made his home. A retired Marine Corps veteran with 20 years of service under his belt, Mr. Chen preferred to keep to himself, tending to his garden and occasionally chatting with the elderly couple next door. What his neighbors didn't know was that he shared his modest ranch-style house with two extraordinary companions, Rex and Shadow, former military working dogs who had served alongside him during 3 intense tours in Afghanistan. Most people walking past the well-maintained property would see nothing unusual about the 2 German shepherds lounging on the front porch. They appeared to be typical pets, watching the world go by with calm, attentive eyes. Sometimes, neighborhood kids would wave at them from across the street, and the dogs would wag their tails in response. But beneath their friendly demeanor lay years of sophisticated military training and combat experience. Rex, the larger of the two, had a distinctive scar above his right eye from his service days, a reminder of a close call during a night patrol. Shadow, slightly smaller but equally impressive, had a unique way of positioning himself to always keep both the front and back of the house in his line of sight, a habit formed during his years of tactical training. Mr. Chen had been their handler throughout their military career, and when the time came for the dogs to retire, he couldn't bear the thought of separating from them. The bond between them had been forged in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. They had saved each other's lives more times than he could count, and now they were family. Life had fallen into a comfortable routine for the unlikely trio. Every morning, they would go for a 5-mile run around the outskirts of town, maintaining their fitness levels even in retirement. The dogs still responded to hand signals and commands in multiple languages, though these days they were more likely to be asked to fetch the morning newspaper than to search for hidden explosives. Thursday evenings were different. That's when Mr. Chen would attend his weekly PTSD support group at the Veterans Center downtown. He found talking with other vets helpful, and the meetings gave him a chance to share experiences with people who understood. During these times, Rex and Shadow had the house to themselves, though they treated their guard duty as seriously as any military assignment. The neighbors never questioned why Mr. Chen's house seemed so secure. The careful lighting, strategic landscaping, and well-maintained security cameras blended naturally into the property's overall appearance. What they couldn't see were the sophisticated motion sensors, the reinforced doors, or the special training area in the backyard where the dogs regularly practiced their skills. That particular Thursday started like any other. Mr. Chen went through his usual routine, checking all the security measures before leaving for his meeting. Rex and Shadow received their evening meal at precisely 1800 hours, followed by a final perimeter check of the property. As Mr. Chen's truck pulled out of the driveway, the dogs settled into their usual positions. Rex near the living room window with a clear view of the front yard, and Shadow in the hallway where he could monitor both the back door and the side entrance. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees that lined the street. To any passerby, the house looked peaceful and ordinary. But inside, 2 of the most highly trained military canines in the country remained vigilant, their senses alert to every sound and movement. Little did anyone know that this quiet evening would soon put their years of training to the ultimate test. The stage was set for an encounter that would remind everyone that appearances can be deceiving, and that the skills learned in combat never truly fade away, whether you walk on 2 legs or 4. On the other side of town, in a dimly lit apartment, 2 men sat hunched over a worn kitchen table, studying photographs they'd taken of Mr. Chen's house. Ray, a tall man with calloused hands and a faded leather jacket, spread out several snapshots showing different angles of the property. His partner, Dave, a shorter man with thick-rimmed glasses, clicked through more photos on his phone. "Look here," Ray pointed to a picture showing Mr. Chen's weekly routine. Every Thursday, like clockwork, he backs out of that driveway at 6:30 p.m. and doesn't return until after 9. 3 whole hours with nobody home. He tapped his finger on the table, confident in their planning. Dave nodded, pushing his glasses up his nose. What about those dogs I've seen? They could be trouble. He'd noticed the German shepherds during their surveillance, but they seemed like ordinary pets, usually lounging on the porch or playing in the yard. Just regular house dogs, Ray assured him, waving off the concern. Probably sleep all day on some fancy bed. Rich people treat their pets like babies these days. He couldn't have been more wrong, but his overconfidence was typical of someone who'd never encountered military-trained animals. They'd been watching the house for nearly a month now, taking notes on every detail. They knew when the sprinklers turned on, which lights were automated, and how long the mail carrier usually chatted with Mr. Chen. What they didn't notice were the subtle security measures, the way the dogs alternated their patrol patterns, the infrared sensors disguised as garden ornaments, or the reinforced windows that looked completely normal. Dave pulled out a small notebook where he'd sketched a rough layout of the house. The back window near the kitchen looks like our best bet. No security bars, and it's hidden from the street by those bushes. He'd spent hours observing the property, but had completely misread the strategic placement of those bushes. They were positioned to funnel any intruders towards specific entry points. They planned to use basic tools, a crowbar, some gloves, and duffel bags for whatever valuables they could find. Remember, Ray said, sipping his cold coffee, we're looking for small stuff we can grab quickly. Electronics, jewelry, maybe a wall safe if we get lucky. They assumed Mr. Chen, being a veteran living alone, would have weapons or valuables stored somewhere accessible. The two men spent the next hour going over their plan repeatedly. They'd park their car 3 blocks away, approach from different directions to avoid suspicion, and meet at the back window. Simple and straightforward. At least that's what they thought. What they didn't know was that Mr. Chen's home security went far beyond ordinary locks and cameras. The dogs weren't just pets. They were highly trained military assets with thousands of hours of combat zone experience. Each had been specifically trained to handle multiple intruders, using sophisticated containment techniques rather than aggressive attacks. Ray and Dave had done their homework, but they'd studied for the wrong test. They'd prepared to rob a regular house with regular security measures and regular pets. Instead, they were unknowingly planning to enter a professionally defended position guarded by 2 of the most sophisticated canine units ever deployed in military service. As the evening approached, they gathered their supplies and double-checked their timeline. The weather forecast promised a quiet night, perfect for their plan. Dave felt a slight nervousness in his stomach, but Ray's confidence was unwavering. "This'll be the easiest job we've ever done," he said, zipping up his dark jacket. "In and out, nobody gets hurt, and we walk away with enough to take a nice long vacation." Little did they know, but their simple plan was about to collide with years of military training and experience. The dogs they dismissed as ordinary pets were anything but, and the quiet Thursday evening they'd chosen for their heist was about to become one they'd never forget. The evening air grew cooler as shadows lengthened across Mr. Chen's property. At exactly 6:30 p.m., his truck had pulled away as usual, leaving what appeared to be a quiet, empty house. Inside, Rex and Shadow moved silently into their defensive positions, their training kicking in as naturally as breathing. Around 7:15 p.m., Ray and Dave approached the house from different directions, just as they'd planned. Ray came through the Andersons' yard next door, ducking behind their rose bushes, while Dave cut through the small alley behind the houses. Both wore dark clothes and carried small backpacks containing their tools. The street was peaceful. A few porch lights had clicked on automatically, and somewhere in the distance, a lawn sprinkler rhythmically ticked back and forth. A cat watched from under a nearby car as the two men converged at the back of Mr. Chen's house, their shoes making soft crunching sounds on the gravel path. "Coast is clear," Dave whispered, pulling out a small flashlight. He aimed the beam at the window they'd chosen, the one beside the kitchen sink. The glass looked ordinary enough, but what they couldn't see was its specialized coating, the same type used in military installations overseas. Ray reached into his backpack and pulled out the crowbar. "This'll be quick and clean," he muttered, more to reassure himself than anything else. The cool metal felt heavy in his hands as he positioned it at the window's edge. Inside the house, Rex's ears twitched at the faint scraping sound, but he remained perfectly still, just as his training had taught him. The window made a soft popping sound as it gave way, much easier than they'd expected. In fact, if they'd been more experienced criminals, this might have raised a red flag. Military-grade security systems often include deliberately vulnerable points, designed to channel intruders exactly where the defenders want them. Dave held his breath as Ray slowly pushed the window up. The house remained dark and silent. No alarm sounded, no lights flashed. It seemed almost too perfect. A gentle breeze carried the scent of Mr. Chen's flowering jasmine plants through the opening, masking any other smells that might have warned them about the house's guardians. "I'll go first," Ray said, placing his hands on the windowsill. He hoisted himself up with surprising ease. The bushes beneath the window provided convenient footing, though they'd been specifically planted there as part of the house's defensive layout. His feet found the kitchen counter, and he carefully lowered himself onto its surface. The kitchen was bathed in the dim blue light from the microwave clock. Ray pulled out his flashlight, but kept the beam pointed downward. The house seemed peaceful enough. Dishes drying in the rack, a cookie jar on the counter, a water bowl on the floor. Everything looked normal, lived in, safe. Dave passed the backpacks through the window, and Ray set them softly on the kitchen floor. The tiles felt cool under his feet as he stepped down from the counter. He did a quick scan with his flashlight, left, right, checking for any obvious security cameras or sensors. Finding none, he gestured for Dave to follow him in. As Dave began climbing through the window, Ray took his first step toward the living room. The floor creaked slightly under his weight, a sound that would have gone unnoticed in any other house. But in this house, that tiny creak might as well have been a starting gun. In the darkness ahead, a pair of trained eyes watched silently. Rex had positioned himself perfectly, hidden in the shadows, but with a clear line of sight to the kitchen entrance. His muscles tensed, ready to move, but he remained still. Years of military training had taught him the value of patience, of waiting for exactly the right moment. Neither intruder noticed the slight shift in the air as Shadow moved silently into position behind them, cutting off their escape route. The trap was set, and like so many adversaries before them, Ray and Dave had walked right into it. Their simple break-in was about to become a masterclass in military canine tactics. The kitchen clock ticked softly as Ray took another step forward, his confidence growing with each passing second. The beam of his flashlight swept across family photos on the wall. Mr. Chen in his military uniform, the two German shepherds sitting proudly beside him. If he looked closer, he might have noticed the special patches on the dog's tactical vests in those photos. But his mind was focused on finding valuables. Dave had just gotten both feet on the kitchen floor when they heard it. A low, deep rumble coming from the darkness ahead. It wasn't the typical bark of an angry house dog. This was something entirely different. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a technique Rex had mastered during his military service to disorient potential threats. What was that? Dave whispered, his hands freezing on the window frame. The confidence they'd built during their weeks of planning began to crumble. Ray's flashlight beam darted nervously around the room, creating dancing shadows on the walls. "Probably just the house settling," Ray replied, but his voice wavered slightly. He took another step forward, and the rumbling grew louder. Then, in the circle of his flashlight beam, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Two eyes reflecting in the darkness, steady and unblinking, set at exactly the height of a large dog's head. But these weren't the excited or frightened eyes of a regular house pet. These eyes held the calm, calculated gaze of a trained professional. Rex remained perfectly still, using his body's dark coloring to blend with the shadows, just as he'd done countless times during night operations overseas. "I think we should get out of here," Dave stammered, starting to back toward the window. That's when he bumped into something solid behind him. He spun around to find Shadow standing there, silent and imposing, blocking their escape route. Unlike a regular guard dog that might bark and lunge, Shadow simply stood his ground, his military training evident in his precise positioning. Ray's hand instinctively went to the crowbar on his belt. The moment his fingers touched the metal, both dogs shifted their stance ever so slightly. A movement so subtle yet so professional that it would have impressed any military handler. They weren't preparing to attack. They were implementing their containment protocols. "These aren't regular dogs," Ray whispered, finally realizing the gravity of their mistake. He'd seen guard dogs before, but this was different. The way these dogs moved, the way they maintained their positions without barking or growling, it spoke of years of sophisticated training. The kitchen felt smaller now, more like a trap than a room. Rex took one step forward, moving with the fluid grace of a trained operative. The message was clear. The intruders could stay where they were, or things would become much more complicated. Dave's trembling hand found Ray's shoulder. "Those photos on the wall," he said, his voice barely audible. "Did you see the uniforms? The tactical gear? We didn't just break into any veteran's house. We broke into a military dog handler's home." The reality of their situation began to sink in. These weren't pets that would be satisfied with a treat or easily scared away. These were highly trained military working dogs, professionals who had faced far more dangerous situations than two amateur burglars. In the dim light, they could now make out more details of their four-legged captors. Rex's scared eye caught the flashlight beam, telling stories of battles survived. Shadow's perfectly maintained stance spoke of thousands of hours of training. Both dogs remained focused, calm, and in complete control of the situation. The tick of the kitchen clock seemed louder now as Ray and Dave stood frozen, trapped between two of the most highly trained military dogs in the country. Their simple burglary plan had just collided with years of professional military experience, and they were about to learn exactly what that meant. The next few moments unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance, though not the kind Ray and Dave had ever wanted to participate in. Rex and Shadow moved with the synchronized precision that only comes from years of working together in high-pressure situations. They weren't just two dogs defending their home. They were a tactical unit executing a practiced containment strategy. Rex took 3 measured steps forward, each movement deliberately slow and controlled. He wasn't trying to frighten the intruders. Fear leads to unpredictable reactions, and military dogs are trained to maintain control above all else. Instead, his movements herded them away from the kitchen drawers where Mr. Chen kept his cooking knives. Dave's back pressed against the refrigerator, its quiet hum a stark contrast to his racing heart. "Maybe we can distract them with something," he whispered, reaching slowly for his backpack. Shadow responded with a single, low rumble, not aggressive, but clearly communicating that any sudden movements would be unwise. The dog's coordination was remarkable to witness, even under these circumstances. When Ray shifted his weight slightly to the left, considering a dash toward the hallway, Shadow adjusted his position with military precision, closing off that escape route. Meanwhile, Rex maintained steady eye contact, his years of training evident in his unwavering focus. "Look at how they move," Ray muttered, his professional pride temporarily overriding his fear. "They're not even touching us, but we can't go anywhere." He was right. The dogs had created an invisible barrier with their bodies, using angles and positioning that would have made their military trainers proud. It was crowd control tactics at their finest, just with 4 legs instead of 2. The kitchen light suddenly flickered on. Motion sensors, another security feature they'd failed to notice during their surveillance. In the bright light, they could now clearly see the dogs' impressive physiques. Their fur was immaculately maintained, muscles clearly visible beneath. These weren't just family pets who happened to know some tricks. Shadow's ears twitched at a sound too faint for human ears, and his posture shifted slightly. The dogs had been trained to communicate silently with each other, a skill honed during covert operations where barking would give away positions. Ray and Dave didn't realize it, but the dogs were actually executing a standard military containment protocol, just adapted for a home environment. Remember that documentary about military dogs? Dave whispered, his glasses fogging slightly from his nervous breathing. The one where they showed them clearing buildings in Afghanistan. Ray nodded slowly, the reality of their situation becoming clearer with each passing second. They weren't dealing with angry guard dogs. They were facing furry veterans who'd probably seen more combat than most soldiers. The crowbar, which had seemed like such a useful tool earlier, now felt impossibly heavy on Ray's belt. He knew that any attempt to reach for it would be a mistake. These dogs had been trained to respond to weapons. They'd probably dealt with far worse than a simple crowbar during their military service. Time seemed to move differently in that bright kitchen. The dogs maintained their positions with a patience that bordered on supernatural. There was no barking, no growling, no stereotypical aggressive dog behavior. Instead, their disciplined presence spoke volumes about their professional training. A car passed by outside, its headlights briefly streaming through the windows. Neither dog flinched or broke their concentration. This level of focus came from years of training in environments far more chaotic than a quiet suburban kitchen. To Rex and Shadow, this was simply another mission, and they were executing it perfectly. The intruders found themselves being supplely but firmly moved into a corner of the kitchen, away from any potential weapons or escape routes. It was like being guided by furry border collies, except these shepherds had military-grade training and had probably faced situations far more dangerous than two unprepared burglars. Ray's fingers wrapped around the crowbar on his belt, his knuckles turning white from the grip. It was a desperate move born of panic, and the moment he reached for it, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted dramatically. Rex and Shadow's response was immediate but measured, showing the kind of restraint that only comes from extensive professional training. Without any aggressive movement, Rex positioned himself closer to Ray, his body language clear and professional. The message didn't need words. The crowbar wasn't going to help this situation. Shadow, meanwhile, adjusted his stance slightly, ready to respond if needed, but maintaining the same calm demeanor that had characterized their entire interaction. "Don't do it," Dave pleaded, seeing his partner's hand on the weapon. "These aren't regular dogs, remember. Look at how they're watching us." He was right. Both dogs were tracking every tiny movement with the kind of focused attention that spoke of thousands of hours of training. The kitchen light hummed softly overhead as Ray slowly moved his hand away from the crowbar. The dog's response was immediate but subtle. They relaxed their stance slightly, though their attention never wavered. It was the kind of professional courtesy you might expect from experienced law enforcement officers, not family pets. "I've never seen anything like this," Ray whispered, a note of genuine admiration creeping into his voice despite their situation. The dogs weren't acting out of anger or fear. They were simply doing their job, maintaining control of the situation with remarkable efficiency. A framed certificate on the wall caught Dave's attention. It was a military commendation for canine service in a combat zone. The glass reflected the scene. Two would-be burglars being expertly contained by two highly trained military dogs who seemed almost bored by the simplicity of their current mission. The dogs' coordination continued to be impressive. When Ray shifted his weight, considering another possible escape route, both Rex and Shadow adjusted their positions in perfect sync, like dancers who had rehearsed the same routine countless times. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary show of force, just precise, professional responses to every action. Time ticked by on the kitchen clock, each second marked by the quiet discipline of their canine captors. The dogs showed no signs of fatigue or impatience. Their military training had prepared them for much longer operations than this, and compared to their past missions, keeping two burglars in check was practically a training exercise. "You know what's really getting to me?" Dave said softly, adjusting his glasses. "They haven't barked once. Not a single time. Every other dog, I've ever seen would be going crazy right now." He was right. The next phase of this unusual standoff demonstrated exactly why military working dogs are considered elite professionals in their field. Rex and Shadow began what appeared to be a standard containment procedure, the kind they'd probably performed countless times in much more dangerous situations overseas. With careful, coordinated movements, the dogs began guiding their unexpected guests toward the living room corner. It wasn't aggressive herding. Instead, they used their bodies like gentle barriers, closing off certain paths while leaving others open. It was like being guided by two furry security professionals who happened to walk on four legs. "They're moving us exactly where they want us," Dave observed, his back gradually getting closer to the living room wall. He wasn't wrong. The dogs were using a technique that had probably been perfected in military training scenarios, controlling movement without causing panic. The corner they were being moved to wasn't random. It gave the dogs clear sightlines to both intruders while keeping them away from any potential weapons or escape routes. There was a large potted plant nearby, family photos on the walls, and a comfortable-looking armchair, all perfectly normal home decorations that also happened to create natural barriers. The digital clock on the cable box blinked 8:15 p.m. They'd been in this situation for less than an hour, but to Ray and Dave, it felt like days. The dogs showed no signs of tiring. Their military training had prepared them for missions lasting much longer than this, and compared to patrolling in a combat zone, watching two burglars was practically a vacation. "Look at how they keep checking their angles," Ray whispered, professional admiration creeping into his voice despite their situation. Every few minutes, one dog would subtly adjust position while the other maintained direct observation. It was the kind of coordinated behavior that came from years of working as a team. A distant siren made Dave jump slightly, but the dogs remained perfectly calm. Their training had taught them to distinguish between relevant threats and background noise. The sound faded away, leaving only the quiet hum of the house's heating system and the soft ticking of a wall clock. The living room lights were still off, but street lamps casting shadows through the windows provided enough illumination to see. Family photos on the walls told a story. Mr. Chen with his unit, the dogs in their military gear, certificates of commendation. It was like being held captive in a museum dedicated to military working dogs. Time continued to pass, marked by the steady tick of the clock and the unwavering attention of their canine guards. Rex maintained his position near the room's entrance, while Shadow had taken up a spot that gave him a clear view of both the captives and the windows. Their positioning wasn't just good, it was textbook perfect. "I never knew dogs could be this professional," Dave murmured, sliding down to sit on the floor. The dogs adjusted their stance slightly but maintained their containment formation. They'd been trained to handle suspects in any position, standing, sitting, or lying down, always maintaining control without escalation. The corner that had become their holding cell was actually quite comfortable. Another sign of the dogs' professional training. They weren't trying to punish or intimidate. They were simply maintaining control of the situation until proper authorities could take over. It was crowd control at its finest, just with 4 legs instead of 2. A car's headlights swept across the room as it turned into a nearby driveway. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound, but his eyes never left his charges. Rex remained equally focused, their military training evident in every calculated movement and maintained position. They weren't just guard dogs, they were soldiers on a mission, and they were executing it perfectly. The quiet tension in the living room was broken by the distant sound of a car engine shutting off. Through the window, headlights swept across the front lawn before going dark. Rex and Shadow's ears perked up in perfect synchronization, but their disciplined stance never wavered. They knew their handler was home early. Mr. Chen had left his PTSD support group meeting earlier than usual that night. Something hadn't felt quite right, a soldier's instinct that had saved his life more than once overseas. As he walked up his driveway, he noticed subtle signs that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. The slightly disturbed gravel near the back gate, the faint scuff marks on his kitchen windowsill. The front door opened quietly, and Mr. Chen stepped inside, still wearing his veteran support group polo shirt. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent years in combat zones, his eyes quickly adjusting to the dim light. The scene that greeted him in his living room made him pause, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. There, in the corner of his living room, sat two very uncomfortable burglars, watched over by his former military partners. Rex and Shadow maintained their positions perfectly, not even turning to acknowledge their handler's return, exactly as their training demanded. They were still on mission, and nothing would distract them until they received proper orders. "Well," Mr. Chen said softly, reaching for the light switch, "I see you've met the boys." The overhead light revealed the full scene. Two sheepish-looking men seated in the corner, their abandoned backpack of burglary tools still lying in the kitchen, and two highly trained military dogs maintaining a flawless containment formation. Ray and Dave blinked in the sudden brightness, their faces showing a mix of relief and embarrassment. The dogs remained focused, their training evident in every controlled breath and steady gaze. They hadn't moved an inch, waiting for their handler's command before changing their tactical position. "Your dogs," Ray spoke up, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. "They're not just pets, are they?" He glanced at the military photos on the wall, then back at the perfectly positioned canines who had so thoroughly derailed their burglary plans. Mr. Chen moved to stand beside his former battle companions, his presence adding another layer of professional calm to the scene. "Rex and Shadow served 3 tours with me," he explained, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen real combat. "We specialized in tactical operations and personnel containment, though I suspect you figured that out by now." The wall clock showed 8:45 p.m. Less than 2 hours since Ray and Dave had first climbed through the kitchen window, though it felt like a lifetime ago. The dogs had maintained their position the entire time, showing the kind of stamina that came from years of military service. "They haven't made a sound," Dave said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Not one bark, not one growl. Just professional." Mr. Chen nodded, pride evident in his expression as he looked at his canine partners. These dogs had been through firefights and combat zones. 2 amateur burglars hadn't even raised their heart rates. The lights from a passing police car briefly illuminated the room. Mr. Chen had called them on his way home, his military training teaching him to always follow proper procedures. Rex and Shadow remained steady, their mission nearly complete, but their focus unwavering. In Afghanistan, Mr. Chen shared, his hand resting gently on Rex's head. These two could contain armed insurgents without causing a scene. Keeping 2 burglars in check, that's just a quiet Thursday evening for them. His words carried no malice, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had seen far more challenging situations. The distant sound of police sirens grew closer, breaking the quiet tension in the living room. Mr. Chen stood calmly beside his canine partners, hands clasped behind his back in a relaxed military pose. Rex and Shadow maintained their professional stance, their mission nearly complete, but their focus still razor-sharp. 2 police cars pulled up outside, their lights painting the living room walls in alternating red and blue. The responding officers approached the front door with standard caution, but Mr. Chen's calm voice called out to them. "Everything's secure in here, officers. My partners have the situation well in hand." When the police entered, they were treated to an unusual sight. Most burglary scenes involved scattered evidence, damaged property, or frightened homeowners. Instead, they found 2 thoroughly humbled burglars sitting quietly in a corner, watched over by a pair of extremely professional German shepherds. One of the officers, a former military policeman himself, immediately recognized the distinctive bearing of military working dogs. "Hold on," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "Aren't these the 2 from that demonstration at the VA last month? The ones who served in Afghanistan?" Mr. Chen nodded, pride evident in his voice as he explained the evening's events. The other officer, taking notes, kept glancing at the dogs with undisguised admiration. It wasn't every day you saw a burglary thwarted with such professional efficiency. No injuries, no property damage, and perfect suspect containment, the first officer commented, shaking his head in amazement. If only all our calls could end this smoothly. He knelt down to get a better look at Rex's military service tags, careful to maintain a respectful distance. As the officers began their standard procedures, taking statements and collecting evidence, Rex and Shadow remained at their posts. They wouldn't stand down until given the proper command. Another example of their thorough training. The backpack of burglary tools still lay untouched in the kitchen, exactly where it had been dropped. Ray and Dave cooperated fully with the police, their earlier bravado completely dissolved by their encounter with the canine veterans. We had no idea, Ray explained, watching as the dogs maintained their vigilant poses. We thought we were breaking into a regular house. Instead, we walked into, well, I guess you could call it a masterclass in military security. The officers couldn't help but chuckle at the situation. One of them radioed in to dispatch. "You're not going to believe this one. Remember those military dogs from the Canine demonstration? Well, finally, with the police ready to take the burglars into custody, Mr. Chen gave the command. Rex, Shadow, stand down. The change was immediate but controlled. Both dogs relaxed their stance but remained alert, shifting from containment mode to regular guard duty with practiced ease. As Ray and Dave were led to the police cars, they kept glancing back at the house. Through the window, they could see Mr. Chen kneeling between his two partners, giving them the praise and affection they'd earned. Even then, the dogs maintained their professional demeanor, tails wagging slightly but bodies still alert. The story spread quickly through the local law enforcement community. By the next day, several Canine unit trainers had called Mr. Chen, asking if he would consider having Rex and Shadow help demonstrate advanced containment techniques to their police dogs. At the police station, the booking officer couldn't hide his amusement as he filed the report. "So let me get this straight," he said, reading over the details. "You picked the one house in the neighborhood guarded by 2 retired military working dogs." The incident became a favorite tale at the local VA, shared among veterans with a mixture of pride and good humor. It served as a reminder that military training, whether on 2 legs or 4, never really goes away. And somewhere in a quiet suburb, 2 German shepherds continued their watch, ready to protect their home with the same professional excellence they'd shown on battlefields half a world away.